An Italian tank commander peers through the viewing port of his P-40 tank. He sees nothing but dust and the distant silhouette of an enemy position. His hand hovers over the firing mechanism. He presses it. The gun fires. Nothing happens. The shell hits the enemy tank and bounces off like a stone thrown at concrete. The enemy tank turns. Its gun swings toward him. He has seconds to understand that he is about to die. This scene repeated hundreds of times during World War II. Italian tankers facing mechanically superior enemies in machines that couldn't fight back. But the question nobody asks is, why? How did one of Europe's industrial powers end up fielding tanks that were essentially useless? The answer is not simple. It's a story of industrial failure, strategic blindness, engineering incompetence, and the collision between ambition and reality. Today, we're going to explore 15 reasons why Italian tanks were among the worst in World War II. Not just ineffective, but catastrophically, embarrassingly ineffective. Reason 15, insufficient armor protection. Paper tanks against steel enemies. Italian tank designers made a fundamental miscalculation about what armor thickness was necessary. They looked at the tanks of 1937, analyzed their armor, drew conclusions. Then they didn't account for one critical factor. Armor technology would advance faster than they anticipated. By the time Italian tanks were deployed in combat, enemy anti-tank weapons had become significantly more powerful. The Fiat L640, one of Italy's most common tanks, had armor so thin that standard rifle rounds could penetrate it in certain areas. A German 37mm anti-tank gun could penetrate Italian tank armor from 1,000 meters away. Italian tanks had to get within 300 meters to have a chance of damaging German armor. This wasn't a minor disadvantage. This was a fundamental imbalance. Pilots didn't complain about inadequate armor. Tank crews did, because armor is the difference between survival and death. Italian tank crews knew they were operating in machines that prioritized speed over protection. They felt every disadvantage. In anti-tank combat, armor is the primary determinant of survival. Italian tanks had lost this competition before the shooting started. Reason 14. Inadequate gun firepower. Shooting peas at fortresses. Italian tanks were equipped with guns that couldn't penetrate enemy armor. The Fiat M1340, Italy's primary medium tank, was equipped with a 47mm gun. This gun had been adequate in 1937. By 1941, it was obsolete. A German Panzer III, the contemporary German medium tank, had a 50mm gun that was measurably more powerful. But more importantly, German tanks were rapidly upgrading to 75mm guns. Italian tanks still had 47mm guns. The firepower disparity created an impossible tactical situation. An Italian tank could see an enemy tank. It could close to firing distance. It could fire repeatedly, and nothing would happen. The shells would bounce off, or they would penetrate, but not catastrophically. Meanwhile, the German tank would fire once, and the Italian tank would explode. This wasn't competitive combat. This was slaughter. Tankers need to believe their weapons can kill the enemy. Italian tankers couldn't believe this, because it wasn't true. Reason 13. Mechanical unreliability. Breaking down in combat. Italian tanks broke down constantly. Not occasionally, not sometimes, constantly. The engines were underpowered and poorly designed. Transmission systems failed regularly. Cooling systems couldn't handle sustained operation. In North Africa, Italian tanks would break down from overheating after a few hours of operation. In Europe, they broke down from cold and mechanical stress. The transmission of the M1340 was particularly notorious. Tankers reported that transmissions would fail after just a few hours of combat driving. A tank that breaks down in combat is a death trap. The crew must abandon it, or die inside it when enemy forces surround it. Italian mechanics were often inadequate to repair the vehicles. Parts availability was terrible. Replacement tanks were slow to arrive. Battles were lost because Italian tanks broke down rather than being destroyed in combat. This was humiliating for tank crews. They weren't defeated by superior enemy tactics or firepower. Their machines simply fell apart. Reason 12. Poor visibility and targeting systems. Shooting blind at enemies you cannot see. Tank commanders need to see the enemy to fight the enemy. Italian tanks had remarkably limited visibility. The viewing ports were small, the optics were inferior. Tank commanders would often spot enemy tanks only after the enemy had already fired. This created a massive tactical disadvantage. The enemy would engage first. Italian tanks would be damaged or destroyed before they even knew combat had begun. The targeting systems were equally poor. Italian tanks lacked proper range-finding equipment. Tankers would estimate distance by eye. Often they would estimate incorrectly. Shells would hit short or long. Meanwhile, German tanks had superior optics, superior range-finding, better visibility. A German tank commander could see an Italian tank at a distance where the Italian tank commander couldn't see anything. This wasn't a minor advantage. This was a fundamental inequality. Modern warfare is about information dominance. The side that sees first wins. Italian tanks saw last. Reason 11. Poor ergonomics and crew efficiency. Designed for torture, not combat. Tanks are incredibly cramped spaces, but Italian tanks were cramped to the point of dysfunction. The turret of the M1340 was so small that the gunner and commander occupied essentially the same space. This meant that loading ammunition required the gunner to contort his body. Aiming required the commander to essentially lie down. In combat, efficiency matters. A crew that can reload in 30 seconds has advantages over a crew that requires 60 seconds. Italian tank crews were slow, not because they were less skilled, but because the physical space wouldn't allow faster operation. The gun breech could barely be opened. Ammunition was stored in positions that required awkward reaching to retrieve. The driver's position was equally poor. Visibility was limited. Control sensitivity was inadequate. Crews that trained in Italian tanks trained in machines that were fundamentally hostile to human operation. Reason 10. Inadequate engine power. Underpowered machines in high-speed warfare. The M1340 had an 105 horsepower engine. This might sound adequate for a medium tank, but it wasn't. The tank weighed about 13 tons. This gave it a power-to-weight ratio that was barely functional. In muddy terrain, the tank would bog down. In sand, it would struggle. On hills, it would move at walking pace. Enemy tanks, particularly German tanks, had significantly better power-to-weight ratios. A German Panzer could maneuver in ways Italian tanks couldn't. It could climb hills that would stop an Italian tank completely. In mobile warfare, mobility is equivalent to firepower. A vehicle that can't move fast enough to reposition can't fight effectively. Italian tanks were slow, not just in top speed, in acceleration, in agility, in every measure of mobility. In North Africa, where battles were decided by rapid maneuver, Italian tanks were strategically useless. Reason 9. Inadequate ammunition supply. Running out of bullets mid-battle. Italian tanks carried limited ammunition. This wasn't a design flaw. It was a consequence of the restricted turret space. A tank that can carry only 30 rounds of ammunition can't sustain prolonged combat. German tanks could carry 50 to 70 rounds, giving them significantly more combat endurance. In a battle lasting several hours, Italian tanks would exhaust their ammunition before the battle concluded. Tank crews had to ration fire. They couldn't fire at targets that weren't absolutely essential. They had to make every shot count. This created psychological stress. Tankers knew that once ammunition was depleted, they were defenseless. They also knew that ammunition resupply in combat was nearly impossible. There was no secondary supply system, no ammunition trucks following the battle. Italian tanks were designed for rapid tactical operations, not sustained warfare. Reason 8. Poor radio communication. Fighting isolated rather than as units. Radios in Italian tanks were unreliable and limited in function. Many Italian tanks had no radios at all. Tank commanders had to communicate through hand signals or by leaving the tank. This made coordinated group operations nearly impossible. A tank platoon should fight as a unit, coordinating fire and maneuver. Italian tank platoons often fought as individuals. Without radio communication, tank commanders couldn't warn each other about enemy positions. They couldn't coordinate attacks. They couldn't request support. German tanks had superior radio systems. German tank formations fought as coordinated units. Italian tanks fought as isolated vehicles. This created a tactical advantage that had nothing to do with armor or firepower. It had to do with communication and coordination. Reason 7. Inferior tank gun design. Guns that barely functioned. The 47mm gun that equipped most Italian tanks was more problematic than simply being underpowered. It was prone to jamming. The ammunition was inconsistent. The gun mounting allowed excessive recoil. Tankers reported that the gun would jam during combat. A few shots and the mechanism would stick. The ammunition was manufactured to varying standards. Some rounds were more reliable than others. The gun had difficulty tracking moving targets. The traversing mechanism was slow and imprecise. Modern tanks need guns that are reliable first and powerful second. Italian guns failed at reliability. A gun that jams in combat is worse than a weak gun. At least a weak gun fires. Reason 6. Slow rate of fire. Reloading while being shot at. The rate of fire for Italian tank guns was approximately 5 to 6 rounds per minute. This means each shot required about 10 to 12 seconds to reload and prepare. German tanks could fire at approximately 8 to 10 rounds per minute. This doesn't seem like a massive difference, but in combat, every second matters. An enemy tank could fire 2 rounds while an Italian tank crew prepared to fire 1. Rate of fire is a measure of combat capacity. The ability to fire repeatedly is sometimes more important than the power of each individual shot. Reason 5. Poor armor sloping and protection. Flat plates against sloped armor. Italian tanks had flat armor plates. German tanks increasingly used sloped armor, which increased effective protection by bouncing incoming fire. This was a crucial technological advancement. Sloped armor at 45 degrees increased protection equivalent to significantly thicker flat armor. Italian armor designers didn't adopt sloped armor as quickly as German designers. By the time Italian tanks were in production, this technological gap was already widening. Effective armor isn't just about thickness, it's about shape. Angle, the way incoming fire interacts with the armor. Italian tanks lost this competition through technological conservatism. Reason 4. Limited industrial capacity. Producing inadequate quantities of inadequate tanks. Italy simply couldn't produce tanks in quantities sufficient for large-scale warfare. Germany produced thousands of tanks. Italy struggled to produce hundreds. Germany had industrial capacity to produce replacement tanks. Italy didn't. When an Italian tank was destroyed, it couldn't be quickly replaced. German losses were replenished. This created an attrition problem that Italy couldn't win. Even if Italian tanks had been adequate, raw quantity would have mattered. Germany had quantity. Italy didn't. Reason 3. Insufficient spare parts and maintenance infrastructure. Broken machines stay broken. A tank that breaks down needs maintenance. Maintenance requires parts. Italy didn't have adequate spare parts supply systems. Tanks that broke down often couldn't be repaired. They were abandoned. German tank maintenance was systematized. Parts were inventoried. Repairs were standardized. Italian tank maintenance was haphazard. Parts were scarce. Repairs were improvised. A tank that can't be maintained is eventually a total loss. Reason 2. Strategic misunderstanding of tank warfare. Built for yesterday's war. Italian tank designers fundamentally misunderstood what tanks needed to be successful in modern warfare. They designed for rapid maneuver. They prioritized speed over firepower. They neglected armor protection. This was appropriate for tank warfare in 1935. It was catastrophically inadequate for tank warfare in 1941. Tank warfare had evolved. Italian tank design hadn't. By the time Italian tanks were deployed, they were already obsolete. Not just tactically, conceptually. They represented a different understanding of what tanks should be than what had actually emerged. Reason 1. Industrial inferiority. Fighting an industrial war without industrial capacity. The fundamental reason Italian tanks were ineffective is that Italy was an industrial weakling trying to fight an industrial war. Germany had vast industrial capacity. Germany could produce tanks constantly. Germany could innovate and upgrade. Italy couldn't compete at this level. Italy tried to produce tanks with an industrial base that was fundamentally inadequate. Every design compromise reflected this inadequacy. Every limitation reflected industrial weakness. The M1340 wasn't the result of bad design choices. It was the result of an industrial system that couldn't produce anything better. Italy was trying to fight a mechanized war with an agricultural economy. The tanks were just the evidence of this fundamental mismatch.